What we are about to show you would have been unthinkable a generation ago. These shouting matches at Senate hearings were never the norm in past administrations. Today, Senator Chris Murphy demanded bottom lines from Secretary Rubio on the Iran blockade and the closed Strait of Hormuz. Rubio held the line, ruling out sanctions relief just to reopen the strait. Watch the exchange. Our research team breaks it down at the end.
Mr. Secretary, for being with us today. Despite the differences that existed between Republicans and Democrats prior to this administration on how to approach Iran's nuclear program, the theory was basically the same, that we were going to impose significant harm on the Iranian economy in order to force them to the table to negotiate. What is happening now is fundamentally different. This war and the administration's decision to blockade has now held the entire world economy and the U.S. economy hostage to the ability to negotiate an agreement with Iran. This is why the entire country is seized by the question of when there will be an agreement, because apparently until there is an agreement, the Strait of Hormuz remains closed. There is a cost to the Iranian economy, but now there is a devastating cost to the U.S. economy. It has been indecipherable, the information coming from the administration, especially in the past several weeks, as we get signals that a deal is imminent. The president said yesterday he's bored by the negotiations. He doesn't care whether we get a deal. I think it's really important for us to understand what your bottom lines are, what you're asking for in this negotiation, what commitments you need Iran to make in order for you to release the blockade, and we hope for them to release the blockade as well. So give us a little insight into what your bottom lines are, what is going to get the strait reopened, because this is kind of the only question that matters for American consumers right now. And every day we get wildly different signals from the president as to whether he even is engaged in this question as to whether the strait is going to reopen.
Yeah, I think your question gets right to the heart of the matter. So I think it's a good question. Let me first bifurcate two things. The only reason there's a blockade, the only reason why there's a U.S. blockade is because Iran has closed they're firing on commercial ships, and they've mined large segments of Hormuz, international waters. And so the blockade is only against Iranian ships. And it's very simple. The notion is if no one's ships are going to get out, then Iran's ships aren't going to get out either. We can't live in a world in which they get to close the straits and tell everybody, pay us a toll or we'll blow you up, but their ships get to go out unfettered. So that's the reason why there's a blockade. There wouldn't have been a blockade if Iran had agreed to do what they said they would do when the ceasefire kicked in, which is they were going to open the straits. So let me just focus on the straits for a moment. Number one, what they're doing is unlawful and illegal. There isn't a country on earth, other than Iran, and maybe Oman that flirted with it, who's in favor of what Iran is doing in the straits. The Chinese are against it. The Russians are against it. Everyone is against it. The whole world is against it. So condition number one is they have to reopen the straits. And reopening the straits means the following. Ships can sail through international waters the way they can do through other choke points around the world without being fired upon, without paying a toll. That's condition number one.
But the strait is closed because of our decision to invade Iran. This is a consequence of our military action. So I guess I'm not interested in litigating that question. We all know why the strait is closed, because you took military action against Iran, and we knew ahead of time that that would be their likely response. The question is, how are we going to get it reopened? Are you going to drive a bargain that is so tough and so hard that the strait remains closed? So how are we going to get it open?
The first thing, that is a predicate to anything else happening. The straits have to be reopened. So the way to think about it is this. If Iran wants to be able to move its oil again through the strait, they will have to reopen the straits. If they refuse to do so, then we have other options available to us, but we would prefer to negotiate the oopening of this, which means
tell us about the negotiations. What do you need from them in order to get the strait reopened? We need the strait reopened tomorrow.
Well, what needs to happen is very simple. They need to announce that they will no longer fire on commercial ships that are going through, or threaten to fire on ships, because in many cases, ships just won't move. They won't go, not because they got fired on, but because of the risk of being fired upon. And so they have to announce very clearly, the straits are now open. We're not charging a toll. We will help remove the mines that they put in there. and they will not fire on ships.
But the president says they also need to make commitments on their nuclear program. That's what I'm asking.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
What commitments do they need to make in order for the Strait to be reopened?
Well, the second thing they have to agree to as part of this is, so in addition to the Straits, that's the predicate that opens the door to phase two. Phase two is they have to commit to very specific negotiations on highly enriched, the disposition of the highly enriched uranium that still is buried deep in a mountain somewhere. They have to agree on negotiating severe and long-term limitations and or cancellation of enrichment activity in their country.
In the second phase of negotiations.
Well, obviously, these are highly technical matters, so I don't think you could work those out in 5 days. That would require a team of experts to meet over a 30, 60, 90-day period and work out the details. But they have to commit to their willingness to do that. For example, they have to commit to say, we will dispose of the enriched uranium, and the question now is, what are the mechanisms by which we do so? That can be negotiated.
Final question. In order to get to that second phase, are you willing to release sanctions or release frozen money that the United States is withholding from Iran?
Right now, everything that's been discussed with them is that any sanctions relief. Now, remember, sanctions come, there's international sanctions, there's congressional sanctions, there's executive sanctions. So some we can release and some we cannot. But any sanctions relief is condition-based, which means it has to be in return for the reason why those sanctions were put in place in the first place, which is their nuclear program. So yeah, look, Iran is being sanctioned because they enrich uranium. Iran is being sanctioned because they've highly enriched uranium. Iran is being sanctioned because of their nuclear activities. If they agree to give up those things, there will be sanctions relief associated with their commitment and compliance with those agreements.
You will not give sanctions relief just in exchange for reopening the Strait?
No, that's not been discussed. That's not been offered.
What made this exchange land was its simplicity. Senator Chris Murphy was not asking about ideology or party or the long history of American policy toward Iran. He was asking about the bill. Who pays the cost of a closed waterway? Who pays the cost of an open-ended negotiation? Who pays when the American economy and the global economy are both held hostage to a deal that the president himself describes as something he is bored by? That is the frame to remember as we walk through the rest of the analysis. Murphy was trying to force a single question into the record. What is the bottom line, and what does it cost the American consumer to get there? Rubio answered with conditions and process. The gap between those two registers is the entire story. Murphy started with a piece of history that often gets lost in cable news framing. For years, Republicans and Democrats actually agreed on the basic theory of how to handle Iran. Both parties wanted to impose serious economic pressure on the Iranian economy in order to force the regime to the negotiating table. The argument was about tactics. The shared assumption was about pressure. That was the old normal. Murphy used that opening to make a sharper point. The current situation is not just an evolution of the old pressure policy. It is, in his words, fundamentally different. Now the United States is also imposing pressure on itself, on its allies, and on the global economy in order to get the same regime to the same table. In the old framework, sanctions hit the Iranian economy hard, while the American economy continued more or less normally. That asymmetry was the whole point, pressure on them, not on us. Now Murphy argued the asymmetry is gone. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. Energy markets are unstable. Allied economies are absorbing real damage. American consumers are feeling it. So the war and the blockade have turned the entire world economy into another chip on the table. The leverage on Iran still exists, but the leverage on America exists too. That is the structural change Murphy wanted on the record, and it is the structural change that makes the entire exchange feel different from a hearing 5 years ago about Iran's sanctions. Murphy did something else that was politically pointed. He quoted the president directly. He said the president had announced the day before that he was bored by the negotiations, that he did not really care whether or not a deal was reached. That kind of quote dropped into a Senate hearing has more than rhetorical weight. It is a fact pattern. It tells allies, markets, the Iranian regime, and American voters that the chief executive of the United States is signaling indifference to the very negotiation that the entire global economy is waiting on. Murphy did not need to editorialize. He simply asked Rubio what the bottom line was, given that the boss says he does not care. This is the core demand of the exchange. Murphy did not want to litigate process. He wanted bottom lines. What does Iran have to do specifically for the Strait to reopen? What does Iran have to do specifically for the United States to release the blockade? What does Iran have to do specifically on the nuclear file? And critically, what is the United States willing to put on the table to get there? Those are the questions the public actually has. Not whether one official is being tougher than another. Not whether one party is more skeptical than the other. The public wants to know what is being asked, what is being offered, and how soon the cost at the pump and on the grocery shelf stops climbing. Rubio's first move was to draw a careful line. He said the United States blockade only exists because Iran has closed the Strait of Hormuz, fired on commercial ships, and mined international waters. From that frame, the American blockade is not a tool of leverage. It is a response. It is the rule that says if your ships cannot get out either, then maybe you will reopen the waterway. That argument matters. It is the official defense, and it is not without merit. Closing a global choke point is an aggressive act. International law agrees. The international response in his telling is broadly aligned with the American position. Murphy did not dispute that Iran was the proximate cause. He disputed the sequence. Murphy's reply was the most quietly devastating part of the exchange. He said, in plain language, that the strait closed because the United States chose to take military action against Iran, and analysts had already warned that this would be the predictable response. That is not a defense of Iran. It is a critique of how decisions get made. If you take an action that has a well-known cost and then you treat the cost as a shock, you are not being honest with the country. You are using a predictable consequence as a reason to escalate further. Murphy did not say the United States should not have acted. He said the country deserved an honest accounting of the price. Rubio then walked Murphy through the administration's two-phase plan. Phase 1 is about the Strait of Hormuz. According to Rubio, Iran must publicly announce that the strait is open, that commercial vessels will not be fired upon, that they will not be threatened, that no toll will be charged, that Iran will assist in removing the mines it placed in international waters. That is a serious list of conditions. It is also a list that can be observed and verified. Ships either move or they do not. Mines either come out or they do not. That is the kind of bottom line that Murphy was actually asking for. It clarifies what would count as compliance on the most immediate humanitarian and economic question. Phase 2, according to Rubio, is the nuclear question that everyone has been arguing about for 2 decades. Iran must commit to specific negotiations on the disposition of the highly enriched uranium that, in Rubio's words, is buried deep in a mountain somewhere. Iran must also commit to severe long-term limits on, or the outright cancellation of, future enrichment activity. Rubio acknowledged that the technical details cannot be settled in 5 days. He said they would require expert teams working over 30, 60, or 90-day periods. The key in his telling is the public commitment to the principle. That is a different test than the straight test. The straight you can see. The nuclear file you have to verify slowly. Then Murphy moved to the most politically loaded question in the entire exchange. He asked Rubio whether the United States is willing to release sanctions or to release frozen money currently being withheld from Iran in order to get this two-phase process moving. That is the question that turns a foreign policy hearing into a domestic political debate. Sanctions relief and the unfreezing of assets are exactly the moves that political opponents typically attack. They are also the kinds of moves that are sometimes necessary to close a deal. Murphy wanted the administration to say, on the record, what it was willing to trade. He wanted the negotiation to be visible to the public, not just to the negotiators. Rubio's answer was careful and important. He said any sanctions relief is condition-based. Then he made the distinction that matters. The original reason for many of these sanctions was Iran's nuclear program. Therefore, the only basis on which the United States is willing to consider relief is concrete movement on that nuclear program. He went further. He explicitly said that the United States will not give sanctions relief just in exchange for reopening the strait. He said that has not been discussed, and it has not been offered. That is a hard line. It tells the Iranians that closing the waterway does not buy them economic relief. It tells the American public that the price for reopening the strait is not going to be additional financial concessions on top of the political concessions already implied. Now you can see why this exchange felt unresolved. Rubio's frame is principled: no relief for closing a waterway, no relief without nuclear progress, no deal that simply rewards aggression. Murphy's frame is practical. The American economy is paying a real cost right now. The president is signaling that he does not care whether the negotiation succeeds. Allies are absorbing damage. The longer the standoff lasts, the more the political price of any eventual deal grows. Both frames can be true at the same time. A patient negotiation that protects American leverage is one kind of success. A fast negotiation that ends the economic pain is another kind of success. Murphy was trying to make sure that the country saw which of those two outcomes was being prioritized. Another piece of the exchange that should not be skipped is Murphy's complaint that the public information coming out of the administration has been, in his word, indecipherable. One day a deal is imminent. The next day the president is bored. One day sanctions are flexible. The next day they are not. Markets respond to that volatility in real time. Oil prices spike on a rumor and fall on a denial. Shipping insurance costs swing. Consumer prices move. A messaging strategy that confuses observers is not just an aesthetic problem. It is a real economic cost. Murphy wanted Rubio to acknowledge the cost of contradictory signals because that cost is something the Senate can legitimately oversee. For years, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz was a worst-case scenario in classified briefings. It was the thing that planners worried about, that economists modeled, that energy analysts ran sensitivity tests on. Now it is real. The classified worst case has become the public daily reality. That changes the way a hearing like this lands. It is no longer an abstract debate about deterrence theory or nuclear timelines. It is a conversation about an actual disruption that is actually affecting actual people in actual ways. That is why Murphy's tone was different from the standard committee tone. He was not running through topics. He was demanding clarity on the only question that, in his view, was still actionable in the short term. Give Rubio his due here. His argument is not a bad one. If the United States starts paying for the reopening of a choke point that should not have been closed in the first place, it sets a precedent. It tells every other nation with the ability to threaten a waterway that the strategy works. Close the choke point, wait for the pressure to build, then collect sanctions relief or frozen assets as the price of reopening. That logic is real. So Rubio held the line. He told Murphy that the only basis for relief is movement on the nuclear question, because that is the underlying issue that all of these sanctions were originally designed to address. That answer protects future American leverage. The question Murphy was raising is what it costs the American economy in the meantime. Despite the heat, there is a real area of agreement here that should not be missed. Both senators and the secretary agree that Iran must reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Murphy did not argue otherwise. He did not propose that Iran be paid for reopening the strait. He did not propose that the blockade be lifted before the strait is reopened. He simply asked whether the administration has a plan to get from the current standoff to the open waterway faster than the current pace allows. Rubio answered that the predicate for any further movement is the reopening of the strait. So the basic destination is shared. The dispute is about timing, about cost, and about whether the United States is being clear with the public about both. Watch what Rubio said about expert teams meeting over 30, 60, or 90-day windows to settle nuclear details. That is reasonable as a technical negotiation horizon. That is also a very long time to sit at an American gas pump. The structural problem in this whole exchange is that two timelines are running against each other. The verification timeline says, take your time, get every technical detail right, do not give away enforceable concessions for unenforceable promises. The economic timeline says, every day the strait stays closed is a day of damage. There is no clean way to resolve that tension, but the country deserves to hear it stated clearly. Murphy was trying to state it clearly. Rubio was trying to stay on the verification timeline. There are two markers worth watching after this hearing. The first is the Strait of Hormuz itself. Are mines being cleared? Are commercial ships moving without incident? Is shipping insurance pricing returning to normal? Those numbers are public and they will tell you whether anything is changing on the ground, regardless of what political leaders say. The second is the public language about sanctions. If the administration starts talking about specific waivers or specific releases of frozen assets, then Phase 2 is genuinely moving. If the language stays at the principle level, with no concrete steps, then the standoff continues. Murphy was trying to set those markers. Rubio was trying to protect their value as leverage. Strip the politics away, and this is what congressional oversight is for. The executive branch makes decisions. The Senate asks who pays for those decisions and what success would look like and how the country knows when success has arrived. Murphy was doing that job. He was not undermining the negotiation. He was asking for a public version of the standard that, presumably, the administration is already using privately. That is a healthy structural function. Even people who fully agree with the administration's approach should want a hearing that produces a clean public record of what success means. Otherwise, there is no way to grade the policy when the next quarter's numbers come in. So we end where we started. The final accountability question is the one Murphy pushed throughout. What was gained, what was lost, and who is paying the cost? If the gain is a credible, verifiable rollback of the Iranian nuclear program, a strait that stays open, a precedent that aggression does not earn sanctions relief, then the administration has a serious case to make. If the cost is a closed waterway that drags on for months, an American economy that absorbs the damage, allies that question American reliability, and a president who publicly signals indifference to the negotiation, then the case becomes much harder. The committee should make both sides put their numbers on the table. Then the public can decide what kind of policy it is actually buying.